Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Jay Mallon, and with Peter Plotke, we're the coordinators of this fall's forum. Peter and I were asked to do this last spring, I guess, and we're given the subject justice. Okay. The reason is St. John's has moved in a big way to all sorts of areas, from gun violence protection to certainly refugees to books for prisoners. Oh, that's a little better. And we thought, okay, we'll do justice, but rather than just have speakers in different specific areas, some of which St. John's is already involved with, we wanted to back off a little bit and have people talk about why justice. Why should people people of faith be involved? And have people talk about their personal experiences as well as whatever programs they're involved with. So I think Peter's going to give us a little preview.
I will, but first, I want to say that when we were asked to do this, we realized we had very big shoes to fill, that the Racers last year had set a very high bar, and they very graciously helped us a lot over the summer to sort of get started. And I see they're here today, and I want to thank you again for all your help and for the great forums that you put on last year. But I think we do have a very strong lineup for this fall, and it's really a very diverse lineup, and it includes folks from outside the parish and folks from within the parish as well. As Ann mentioned in the service next week, we will have an immigration-themed forum in which Reverend Charlene Belsoms-Elmer will talk about the Congregation Action Network and its work helping refugees. We will have a discussion about the U.S. Institute of Peace and its efforts around the world to encourage conflict resolution. That's in October. Also in October, we will have students from Youth Creating Change giving us student perspectives on student-led social justice projects. The Reverend Dr. May-Elise Cannon will be joining us as well. This is sponsored by the Holy Land Committee, and she leads Churches for Middle East Peace. We'll have a disability rights advocate who also happens to be the brother of a parishioner, coming to talk about justice and disabilities rights in November. Jim Wallace, theologian, writer, and activist, and author of a new book coming out this fall, Christ in Crisis, Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus, will be speaking in November, as will our very own Jay Mallon, talking about the history of lynchings in Montgomery County. December 8th will bring us gun violence prevention task force presentation, and we'll wrap up before Christmas with Ray Suarez and his Advent reflection. Ray was unable to join us last year because of illness, but he's well again, so we're looking forward to have him on December 15th. So that sort of gives you an overview of the wide range of forums that we're having this fall, and I very much look forward to them, and hope to see you all here as regulars on Sunday. And with that, we'll focus on our forum today. We have a great kickoff forum for you, and I'll hand it over to Ann for the introductions.
So good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many people here. Since there's some new people, I'm Ann Dursey. I'm the deacon here at St. John's. And I'm so delighted that we have Sister Quincy Howard with us to launch this important Fall Forum series on justice. And when you hear about her life, you'll understand why. And we had several conversations before I met her this morning, and we had something very much in common. We bonded instantly. We both have had careers in other fields before we got a call to our current vocation. Sister Quincy had worked as a urban planner in community development and disaster relief, and at a certain point in her life, thinking about how do I put my faith in action, she received a call. And we invited her here today because her call is focused on justice, or as we often say, social justice. Now, there's nowhere in the Bible that talks about social justice. It's justice. But we use that term all the time, social justice. What does it mean? We're going to start that exploration today by hearing about Sister Quincy's life and her ideas around justice and what you do to put your belief in justice, biblical justice, into practice in your life. Today she works with Network, which is an organization that was founded by Catholic sisters in 1971. We'll talk more about that in our conversation. Lobbying on Capitol Hill for causes that are important in the Catholic social justice, well, the Christian social justice tradition, the social justice tradition. So with that, she's a member of the Order of Sinsinawa in Wisconsin, but here in Washington, she's affiliated with the community of Assisi, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's very brief, but we'll talk more about your
Sure.
background
I'll
later.
fill in the gaps. Is this on?
It is
Okay,
on.
great.
Do you want to use
Perfect.
the podium?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'd love
Okay.
Good morning. It is really such a joy to be here. I was humbled to be invited to talk to you about my faith journey, and I couldn't have had a better setup with that sermon. I am here to tell my story, and I really look forward to sharing it with you. To repeat a little bit of what she said, I'm Quincy Howard, so I am a Catholic nun. Specifically, I'm a sister of the Dominican order. So the Dominicans were founded about 800 years ago by St. Dominic, and we're also known as the Order of Preachers. My congregation of Dominicans is out of Wisconsin, the Sinsinawa Dominicans. When I think about my faith journey, she alluded to the fact that I was a late bloomer. It really started in my mid-30s, so a little less than a decade ago. I was living in New Orleans, and I was working as a management consultant for disaster recovery and relief efforts. My background, I got into that work post-Katrina, and my background was in urban planning, so I had worked in various capacities for nonprofits doing natural resource planning, for local governments trying to help develop affordable housing, and as a volunteer in the Peace Corps doing community development in Honduras. So it was a pretty diverse experience that I had accrued, and disaster recovery utilized a lot of the same skills. So my career was on, for all practical purposes, a really good trajectory. I guess you could say I was a rising star in what my company a little bit too gleefully called a growth industry. But what I was noticing was that as I was getting promoted, my work felt like it was getting more and more distanced from the people that it were meant to benefit, those who had been impacted by disasters. So I would say I got to the point that I had to recognize that I was secretly very unhappy, and I had also suffered for over 10 years from chronic back pain, and I just got to the point that I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue on that trajectory. So I decided two things. I was going to figure out what was wrong with my back finally, and I was going to find out what direction I needed to take my career. Something that would be more fulfilling, where I felt like the benefits would be more palpable for me. And as we know, the mind-body connection is very real, so that journey to figure out what was wrong with my back quickly morphed into a spiritual search. And I would say that I was very intentional about how I was going to move forward with this sort of dual trajectory search process, because I'm very methodical like that. And I had decided that I was going to stay as open as possible, and that I wasn't going to preclude any possibilities prematurely. And so I began. And the irony was that even at the get-go, out of the gate on my spiritual search, I had already precluded Christianity. And I wasn't looking there because, to give a little bit of background, I had a Catholic mother, my father was agnostic, and I grew up in East Texas. So Catholicism in the Bible Belt tends to be pretty traditional and pretty conservative. And by the time I was, I would say 12 years old, I had kind of decided that I wasn't buying into that. And my dad's approach of just acknowledging that there was no way I could understand God and leave it at that seemed a lot more reasonable and honestly easier, a little more low maintenance for an approach to me as a 12-year-old. So that was really my approach to religion and spirituality for the next 20 plus years. I did think that there was something, but it wasn't a primary concern for me. So I would say that two things happened around that same time that were pretty pivotal. As I was in the midst of these searches, the first thing was I was vaguely aware that I always referred to myself as a non-practicing Catholic, so I sort of kept the cultural identity of it, but the religious part I had done away with in my mind anyway. But I was aware that the Pope had decided to retire, and that was not even a thing. That had never happened, and it was huge. So it had made it onto my radar. And I had also heard some murmurings about the new Pope that had been brought in by the Vatican, and that he was very different. So I came across, it was his first interview in America Magazine, and I started reading it because I was kind of curious. And it blew my mind. I had no idea what this guy was talking about. I had never heard Catholicism in these terms, and it resonated so deeply. He was describing the same values that had really guided my own career path, trying to help others, trying to make sure that those who were disadvantaged got a leg up. And so it was new to me, and it really sparked an interest about Catholicism again, and maybe there's something there that I didn't quite recognize as a 12-year-old. So it opened me up to that prospect. And then soon thereafter, I was watching the Colbert Report, and he interviewed this delightful woman, Sister Simone Campbell. And she was talking about a crazy bus tour that she and a bunch of nuns were making across the country, trying to raise awareness amongst Americans about the need for everybody to have access to healthcare coverage. And she was hilarious too. And I thought, I connected some dots, and I thought, this is the same Catholicism that I just read about from this new Pope. There's something here I really need to explore. And it started some wheels turning. And I had actually gone to a Catholic private liberal arts college in Chicago. I never went to Mass the whole 4 years I was there, but I went to school there, and I did have some Dominican sisters as professors who I adored. And always had the sense, like, there's something really special about these women, right? I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew there was something. And I also was aware of the demographics of women religious in the United States. It is very real. They are in an era of diminishment right now. The median age of women religious is somewhere around 80 years old. So that was in the back of my mind. And then I started thinking, I know that a lot of these congregations have institutions and buildings and land and assets as part of the church. And what are they going to do with them when they're not around? I bet that they want to do some really cool stuff, right, to carry their legacy forward. And so these wheels were turning, and I kind of started going down that career search path and thinking about, well, I'm a planner. That's something that I could maybe do. It would be reasonable, but I didn't know anything about the prospect. So I got in touch with one of my old sisters that I had kept in touch with and asked if we could have a conversation. So we were talking, Sister Clemente, and I was telling her, I didn't even know what I was asking totally, so I was saying things like being at a crossroads and trying to figure out which path I needed to go down, and wondering if I could learn more about the challenges that the sisters were facing, and more about women religious. And she was very open and excited to hear that, and put me in touch with this person named Jerry, and said, here, contact Jerry. Jerry can answer any of your questions. This is the person you want to talk to. So I emailed Jerry, and I was thinking, this guy must be like a program manager or maybe a COO for the congregation. I was a consultant, right? This is where my mind was. And so I emailed Jerry, and he responds and is extremely friendly and inviting, and says if I ever want to come to visit the Mother House in Wisconsin, I'd be more than welcome to do that. And by the way, we're hosting a retreat in about a month if you'd like to come to that. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. It's like killing two birds with one stone. I can go and meet this Jerry guy and do a little market research, see if this is even a thing, maybe a little business development, I don't know. And then on the side, I can go to this retreat and find out about this Catholic thing that is all of a sudden on my radar and seems really compelling to me. So it seemed perfect. I got my ticket, was ready to go, and about 3 days before I caught my flight, I got an email from Sister Clemente, and she was ecstatic. I was going to this retreat, and she attached a flyer, and I opened it, and it was a treat for women considering religious life to become nuns. Yeah, and so I immediately panicked and was about to cancel my flight. I was like, I can't go in there like that. They're gonna see me as an imposter, coming in trying to get business, playing like I wanna be a sister. I just can't do this. And then I kind of talked myself down a little bit and reminded myself of my promise to stay open and not to preclude any possibilities prematurely. So I thought, well, you know, this is really the same thing as before. I didn't know I was going anyway, and worst case scenario, I just gently break it to them after the retreat. It's probably not a good fit. So I decided I was going to go anyway, and I showed up with my defenses up, because I was thinking this was going to be some kind of like Marine Corps recruiting tactics, right? So I was kind of like, my strategy was to go to this retreat and be so brutally honest and candid about where I was spiritually and in the church that they were gonna realize this is not a good fit. Thank you, but no thank you. So that was what I was gonna do, and I went to the retreat, and as you may have guessed, Jerry was a sister, and Jerry was the vocation director. So Jerry is not a man or a COO. And I went to the retreat with Jerry, who was absolutely lovely, and really had a lot of stereotypes broken down about women religious. And my eyes were opened to this amazing, unique, countercultural way of life that they had created for themselves over a couple of centuries. This congregation was started in the mid-1800s, and a feminist model of governance, and super supportive, really joyful, very peaceful. And these women got stuff done, very effective at doing good work. So I was intrigued, and I can say that they were also intrigued by me. I remember at one point even saying, along with my strategy, I don't really know how to pray. And their response was to Xerox a bunch of resources so I would know the different kinds of prayers, and to explain that there were a lot of options. And they seemed really excited about me being there, which I could not understand. In retrospect, I recognized that they saw in me the movement of the Spirit. I didn't know that was happening. In fact, when I left the retreat, something had shifted in me, but that was that I decided maybe my career path was to become a recruiter for other young women, to know that this was an option for them, because it was so great. Not even in my career field at all, but that's what I was thinking. And it only took a couple of weeks back in New Orleans for me to start having to come to terms with the fact that I was thinking about myself, right? And then it was within a couple of months, I was actually filling out the application. Nobody knew about this. I was totally in the closet. I was just doing it. I mean, I was just following. So anyway, I filled out the application, and let me see, I want to make sure I get all of this in here. So, and then I started telling my friends and family, which was a huge shock to them. Some thought I was joining a cult, and they had no idea what to make of this. But the rationale I had come up with was, because I wasn't going to become a nun, you see. I had learned in the formation process, in the retreat, about this thing called a formation process. That's 3 years. You don't become a sister. You live with the sisters, you learn from the sisters, you deepen your spirituality, you form relationship with them. And all of that is to discern whether or not a vowed life is right for you moving forward. It wasn't right for me, I was sure, but that process sounded really great. So I thought that's what I'm gonna do. That's what I'm applying for, is this 3-year formation process. And I was comparing it to my Peace Corps. It's so crazy to think back on this. I was like, it'll be like Peace Corps. I'll go in, it'll be a foreign culture. I'll go in, I'll definitely have to adjust my behavior patterns. I'll have to learn like some new language probably, and it's not gonna be easy. I'll buckle down for it, and I'll come back to New Orleans a better person, a wiser person. It'll stretch me. All of the things that Peace Corps did to make me a richer person. Not financially, obviously, but, and so that was my rationale, and I was sticking to it. And, but I did have two rules when I joined the sisters. The first one was for these 3 years, even though I wasn't going to take the vows, I was going to fully live into this process and milk it for all that it was worth, right? And I didn't know why I was doing it, but I thought, this is for a reason, and so I'm going to do it right. And the other rule I had was that I was going to be candid with the sisters and totally honest with them about where I was in my process, in my intentions, just lay it all on the table for them. Because I had learned that the formation process and the discernment is not just me discerning the congregation, but also that they discern me as if I'm a good fit or not. And I thought, well, these ladies are the professionals. They know what they're looking for. So if I'm just honest, then they'll let me know if and when it's time to cut the cord, right? So that was my rationale going in. And I can say the first 2 years was, it was amazing. I totally felt like a tourist and loved every minute of it. It was like one of those experiences where you ask yourself, how did I ever get the privilege of being immersed in this thing that nobody seems to even know about, right? It was just so unbelievably eye-opening, and they were all embracing. They really welcomed me with open arms and supported me. And then I can say in the third year, when in the sermon, when you talked about narrative identity, that kicked in big time in the third year, because it became a real struggle for me. It was becoming easier and easier to imagine life as a sister, but I had this resistance because that's not what I was going to do. So the third year was difficult in an interior way. And I remember the pivotal moment in that year was when I spoke with the formation director, Marianne, at the time, about feeling like maybe I should just leave the process and not do the third year, because it seemed like I was kind of wasting their time. I wasn't really any closer to deciding that I was going to take the vows, which is what they were hoping for. And they were supporting me through this whole process, and I just felt like I was wasting their time. And Marianne said, she encouraged me to do the full 3 years, because it's a process. She said, trust the process. And then she said that their goal was not that after formation I take the vows, that their goal was that after formation I had become the best person that I could possibly be. Who says no? Who says no to that, right? So that for me allowed me to, again, live into the third year without that pressure that I had been putting on myself. And quite honestly, by the time halfway through the year, I was very much leaning towards considering taking the vows. And I was really kind of hard pressed to come up with reasons that I wouldn't. Because first of all, I was discerning taking first vows, and the way that the process works is that after formation, then you take first vows, also called initial vows, also called temporary vows, because you take a vow, you fully become a sister, but it's for a finite period of time. It's for 3 years. And so you live into it as fully as you can, and then at that 3-year point, then you begin to discern if you're going to take perpetual vows for life. So I couldn't think of a reason not to do this, and it felt so right. I was very happy, and my back was getting better too. So I decided that I was going to take the vows, and a couple of months before that, I was starting to think about, well, if I do take the vows, then what am I going to do as a ministry? Because as an urban planner, that's not exactly an obvious fit for a nun. And so I was thinking through possibilities, ways that I could apply myself as a ministry. And I came across a job opening at Network Lobby, and I quickly realized, oh, Network Lobby, that's the same place that did that crazy bus tour. And as I started reading about it, they were hiring a lobbyist. It was a lot of policy work, and I had done policy work. So I thought, oh, well, maybe that could be a good fit. I don't know, I'll give it a try. And I applied for the job. I also want to give a little side note about what was happening in the world and in the US during my formation, those 3 years where I had sort of stepped out of the world to do my own journey. At the very beginning of my formation process were the protests in Ferguson and the beginning of Black Lives Matter. The rise of ISIS was happening. And that was just the beginning. You all have been there for the last 3 years. You know that it has, for me anyway, it felt like there was this spiraling out of control of the world and in the United States. So I'm sort of watching this like it's a horror movie while I'm on my own spiritual journey. And one of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis is that being a good Catholic means meddling in politics. So that was a sign to me that I just needed to once again just jump in the deep end and give it a try. So that's what I did. And by the way, this part of Catholicism that I newly discovered for me, you may have realized that was Catholic social justice teaching. So it's a whole thing. We'll talk about that. But so I took my vows. I moved to Washington, D.C. to start lobbying as a nun on Capitol Hill. And it was not an easy transition because I had a completely new identity that I needed to start living into in a new community, in a new field, in a new city, in a crazy environment. So it wasn't easy going, particularly at first. But I tried to live into it. And my professional experience had not at all prepared me for what I had gotten myself into. Policy a little bit, but Washington, D.C. is a unique and bizarre environment. I'll just put it that way. So fortunately, I had in formation learned a lot of practices, spiritual practices, to help me cope with the environment and keep me grounded. But I was really concerned that all of that work I had done for 3 years to try and get healthier was just going to go out the window, fly out the window as soon as I got to DC. And that was a fair concern, quite honestly. The first 6 months were a real challenge for me. I would say that the two things I learned in that initial transition, the first one, I have never been a salesman. It is not me to try to convince people of something or to influence them on something. It's just not my MO. It never has been. But I'm a really good lobbyist when I'm doing it on behalf of other people. So that was encouraging to know that I could bring it if I needed to bring it, especially if it was for somebody else. And the other thing that I learned was that there are a lot of type A personalities in Washington, D.C. A lot of busy people that are really freaking out, and maybe as a sister coming to D.C., it wasn't helpful to have another one. So those tendencies of my own, because I do have type A personality tendencies, I curbed them, and I tried to engage, and I think fairly successfully engage in a different way, a healthier way, focus more on relationships, and not be as task-oriented, and not take some things so seriously. So that has been very helpful to me as well. I would say just a little bit about Network Lobby. Our social justice platform really grew out of struggles that people living in poverty have. And so we look at policies on healthcare, on immigration, on economic inequality, social safety net programs, and access to democracy or democracy reforms. So the first bill that I worked on when I came to Washington, D.C. was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that was complete insanity. It was nothing even resembling like normal legislative process, which I wasn't even totally up to speed with in the first place, so maybe that worked in my favor. But it was really a terrible bill, quite honestly. And the more that I learned about it, the more I realized that all of the ways that I thought a government should be nurturing society and supporting people, it was doing the opposite. And it was a real tough pill to swallow when it passed, but a good learning experience for me about the reality of the political scene in Washington, D.C. So after that, I was then asked to work on the Farm Bill, which made no sense to me at all, until I learned that 80% of Farm Bill funding actually goes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program to feed people that live in food insecure households. So there was a lot of concern that SNAP was going to be cut and that people would not be getting the nutrition assistance that they needed, particularly children. So I lobbied and worked on that bill to try and make sure that the program was left intact. And I can say that that was actually one of the few bipartisan success stories that came out of 2018. So that was sort of kind of made up for my experience with the tax bill and was a bit of a silver lining. And now that we are in a new congressional session with very different dynamics, I am working on wages and labor justice. So I worked on the Raise the Wage Act that just passed in the House. And I am also working on democracy reforms. There's a lot of different legislation right now trying to fix the many, many ways that our democratic systems have been corrupted over the years, whether that's money in campaigns, whether that is gerrymandering, voting rights, take your pick. So that's been a big focus of mine also. Just to finish, I would say that DC and politics right now in general, we all feel it. It is caustic, and DC is like ground zero for this political warfare, right? And that's what it is. It's political warfare, and it's an extremely stressful environment, and it's frenetic, and it's unhealthy and dysfunctional. I know this sounds really dark. It is dark, but it's taken a lot of effort to stay spiritually grounded. And I've spoken with people who have been working in this field for decades, and they have affirmed that we are in a place now that they've never seen before. So it's not just me, I'll put it that way, it's not just me. I did want to say that the thing that has really been my saving grace has been community. So I encourage you all, as you decide how you want to move forward working on issues of justice, to strengthen. It seems like you have a great community here to keep that strengthened and to lean on each other to help you get through whatever challenges and discouraging things may happen on that path. I live in a local community called Assisi House, and it's got some religious as well as lay people, and they've been extremely supportive and helpful. And then at Network, all of my coworkers are also the same and fun. And I do want to call out, there's sort of a coalition of faith-based advocacy groups that work on Capitol Hill, including the Episcopal Church. And there's a really tight-knit community of faith-based advocates, and it is multi-faith. We have a Muslim, Jewish, all Christian denominations, and it is a small but mighty group. So that also helps me get through the day-to-day reality of working on the Hill. That is the story, that's where I am, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Come on up and help the thing. So thank you, that was really beautiful. And I want to give enough time here for a conversation and questions from the audience, so I'm going to truncate my questions, Quincy. But we did talk a little bit about helping us understand social justice, because it's a term that is widely used. I'm not sure how you define it. I'd like to know. And you mentioned the Catholic tradition of social justice work. And perhaps you could also address briefly why 47 Catholic nuns in 1971 decided to found this group called Network, which was founded specifically to do political activism on the Hill on issues of social justice.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I would say that Catholic social justice is it is a specific line of teaching that comes from the church itself, from the hierarchy of the church, and some of these teachings really started to be pushed out to Catholics around the world in the late 1800s, and it grew out of really some of the exploitation and the dynamics that the church saw happening with the rise of capitalism, as well as when the machinery and manufacturing and businesses and all of these dynamics, and they began to see that these could and were having detrimental effects on society and on people's lives. So that was the origin of Catholic social teaching. And then it had sort of another resurgence, some more publications from the Vatican around the Depression era, talking about human dignity. And then in the 60s and onward, there's really been this proliferation of works from the Catholic Church about issues like oppression and the common good and human dignity. And I think you all name values like inclusion and compassion and charity and openness as part of your mission. And all of those values, when you get down to it, are gospel values. They are the core of gospel values. And the way that I read Catholic social justice and the way that I think about it is really trying to, in the modern day, create systems that show that kind of compassion and allow people to live lives of dignity and to have what it is that they need. There have always been people who can't necessarily take care of themselves as well as other ones, and back to the Old Testament, there are mandates to society that we are meant to make sure that they are cared for. And so our idea, and the Catholic Sisters' idea, was to bring those values into the way that the government is set up and the governmental systems, to make sure that they could reflect those values in the way that they are organizing society. So the sisters, it was really kind of a groundbreaking idea for sisters to start a lobby organization, because for the history of women religious in the United States, they had been providing charity, right? That was their gig, and that's what they were known for, and they did it. I mean, there were armies of sisters, even back to the frontier days, that were filling in the gaps and providing charity for the most poor and destitute in the United States, before it was the United States. So when there was Vatican II was a pivotal point in the Catholic Church, and it was in the mid-60s, and it was huge, and the idea there was to open up the church to issues of the world and to other faith traditions, as well as taking a fresh look at these social teachings, which is part of why there was such a proliferation of new teachings that came out of that. And women religious in the United States really took to heart the mandate for them to do all of those things. That was the same time that many congregations decided that wearing a habit when they were working out in communities wasn't helping them to do their ministries better. It was leading to separation between them and the communities that they served. So that was the rationale for deciding to go plain clothes. And there was a group of sisters that really wanted to try and figure out what could be a ministry that in addition to providing charity would also try to get at the root causes of the need that we've been trying to meet for the whole history.
Changing systems.
Correct, systemic changes. And so there was a conference of lots of different orders and congregations of women religious, and out of their brainstorming process and the movement of the Spirit, they decided that they should start their own lobby organization. And they had massive membership ready to go with women religious across the country. And they also had a very unique voice of integrity that people were going to listen to, because they're the ones that had been providing the services. So when they come to a lawmaker and they say, you need to do this because that's what's causing these problems that we've been addressing, people tend to listen and pay attention. So that is what Network has been doing for the last 50 years quite successfully. I had mentioned the demographics about women religious. So since probably 2000, there have been less, the year 2000, there have been less and less sisters available to staff Network. So we have shifted into what we are calling open to all. And we've been bringing in lay staff people that not just Catholic, a very inclusive, we have staff of about 20, a lot of young people, some Muslims that are working with us, and but we remain true to the Catholic social teaching as the core of the policy work that we do.
Thank you. Maybe before we turn to questions, you could offer us your thoughts a little bit on how a community like ours can get involved in this work. I mean, you mentioned the small but mighty group of engaged people on the Hill. And I should also mention that Sister Quincy was one of the 70 Catholic clergy and lay people who was arrested recently on Capitol Hill protesting the current immigration policies.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily condone civil disobedience, but I feel like depending on the times that we are living in and the issues that we're confronting, civil disobedience can be a very powerful tool to bring to bear when you you just need to resist what is happening. And I think nonviolent resistance has been part of our history and the civil rights movement. I mean, you know the stories, right? So these are always very powerful tools that are available to people that want to see change. But for your congregation, I would suggest, because there's so much noise out there and there are so many issues, that it's really hard to figure out even where to put your focus. And I think what could be most effective is to pick the area that you're going to go all the way and you're going to focus your energy, and then for the other things that you also care about, you plug into existing initiatives that are getting some momentum, that are hopefully led by the people that are impacted, right? And you start to form relationships with those initiatives, and you try to deepen them, you support them, you expand them in whatever way you can, and you just be allies. Yeah, that would be my suggestion. And I'm going to put in a little plug from my own work, where I find my passion at Network, policy-wise, is in the democracy reform initiatives, because I do feel like we are, as a nation, at a pivotal moment where it's make it or break it time. There have been so many different Supreme Court decisions and dynamics, big data, different things that are whittling away at representation in our country right now, that it is causing real cynicism. And that would ultimately be our downfall as a nation, I feel, if we don't begin getting our own shop in order to then be able to pass all of these other policies that really need to happen. You have to have a foundation to work from. So I would encourage you to keep that high on your radar as well.
Thank you. Can we have some questions? Yes, Sari. And everyone, please speak directly into the mic so we can capture your comments.
Thank you so much for joining our conversation on justice. I feel so inspired by your words. So I want to take one step back. As you know, one of the themes that we're wrestling with this season is what is justice? And as we know, justice for one group sometimes feels like injustice to another group. So what do you understand as, when you think about justice, how would you help a congregation crystallize what is justice? And when you have two groups that are saying that justice for them is actually, their ideas of justice are in conflict with one another, how do you begin to frame which one you want to go with? Is that a clear enough question?
Yes.
I've got some examples, but I don't want to waste our time. So.
No, it's clear, and it's complicated, right? I can't say that I can give a clear-cut answer. What my benchmarks are, populations and people who have been marginalized historically and who have not seen the same opportunities as others, and who are currently experiencing oppression, whether that is through predatory debt practices or our criminal justice system and incarceration for laws that aren't even on the books anymore and they're still in prison for them. I think that those are the populations that at this point in time need to take precedence. Because my mantra is that I want to see everyone get enough. I know that's very general, but I feel like a lot of people and our culture tells us to do this. In the United States, we confuse needs and wants. And there is, we can we can feel entitled sometimes to things that we're used to getting, and if it's threatened, then it feels like an affront. But my idea of justice is that there is enough openness and communication between both parties that that you can see how one actually is a benefit to the other party in the long run. It's taking the long sight. It's not taking necessarily the immediate impacts of something, but a broader view of what is going to make our society healthier overall so that we can all thrive. Because income inequality and the growth of income inequality, that is, everyone suffers from that. It is not just the people on the bottom that are feeling the impacts from that. And it's only going to continue to break apart our society and our country if we let that run unhinged.
Other questions?
I've been very troubled at how the press and political leadership deals with this question of Christianity and who's a Christian and what do they believe, and particularly my concern about the evangelical right voice being seen as the Christian voice in politics. And I wonder how you feel that on the Hill and how you kind of try to expand and redefine with other faith groups what this means and how social justice can be interpreted as not necessarily a right-wing approach to social justice. That's a little bit like Sari's question, I guess.
Yeah, I think, you know, I have been noticing in this new Congress, it seems like the left, for lack of a better description, even politicians are beginning to recognize how they have really given up that voice. They've deferred it and they have let it be usurped for political reasons in a specific direction. And I think there is a real effort at this point to try to reclaim that. And the coalition that I work with of faith advocates, we really try to support them in that and provide forums for politicians to start like getting their sea legs to talk about faith values. Oh my gosh, who does that on the left, right? So I do feel like, I'm hoping anyway, that this is something that is emerging and that there's really the beginning of a pushback of that narrative identity of what Christianity means in our country, and a reclaiming of the deeper values that I'm alluding to that go back to the Old Testament. So I think just continuing to preach it.
Is there anyone working specifically in healthcare access within the network?
Yes, so Sister Simone, who is my boss, the executive director, she is so invested in what is happening with the healthcare debate right now. The sisters actually had a really pivotal role when the ACA was passed. The bishops, the American bishops, had said they wouldn't support it because of the same one issue that always is talked about related to Catholicism, the abortion issue. And all of the other benefits that would come out of this were not being taken into account. And when the Catholic Sisters through Network rallied around the healthcare bill and signed a petition by all of the Catholic sister leaders in the United States and sent it to Congress saying we support this bill, it was what a lot of Congress lawmakers needed to shield them to be able to vote for the bill. So, and it got the sisters in trouble with the Vatican, and it got Network in trouble also. So it was not without controversy. But Sister Simone, that is where her heart is. That is where her focus is. And we have a devoted staff member right now that is only working on healthcare. So and there's a lot going on with healthcare. It's such a confusing mess right now. It's hard to know where things are going to start gelling and what that's going to become, where the momentum is coming. But we're following it very closely and trying to push where we're able to.
Okay. Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Oh, okay. I think not treating the American worker well is a huge issue. I see it with my patients, like in their 20s, they're not getting benefits on their jobs, even educated people, they're not getting health care, but there's no, they might get a shift work, and then if they can cancel at any time, So and the contract working that's constant versus a real job. I have a patient that's had 2 unpaid internships living at home trying to get. So how does this impact our future in terms of income equality? Because I think the income inequality, particularly with our young males, is really concerning.
It is deeply concerning. I would say, I mentioned that we at Network that I worked on the Raise the Wage Act. That is like the very tip of the iceberg of what needs to be done to address all of the issues that you're talking about. Really the labor market in general has slid so far away from policies and practices that empower workers to be able to negotiate for themselves, whether it's through unions or contracting practices. Where we are seeing, I hope anyway, that this is a point where we're at rock bottom of workers' rights. And at Network, we've developed what we call Livable Income platform, and it includes policies about individual wages and wage equality, gender gaps, and then it also talks about policies that are targeted at employers and how they engage with workers and the rules that they go by. And then we also look at some macro level governmental policies about like full employment and being prepared for something like a recession so that you can buffer those impacts. But there's so much work to be done around workers. And the other thing is that so many of the safety net programs are trying, at this point, the line is to add work requirements to them, right? To make people able to get Medicaid if they work this much, to make people able to get nutrition assistance if they get a job and work 20 hours a week. And we know that the reality is that people can't just decide they're going to work 20 hours. It's just not that easy. As you're talking about, there's scheduling that people have no control over. You have zero benefits. What if you get sick and lose your job? And then you're not going to be able to get your benefits. So there's all of these waterfall effects that just devastate people.
Well, I think we've run out of time. Unfortunately, we could go on at great length, but thank you so very much for sharing your personal story and all the great advice. Thank you.